Thanks for having me here today, everyone, and thanks for everyone attending. I mean, it's great getting a group like this together, not only to discuss issues with repairs and conservation, but also governing plans that were discussed earlier and the philosophy surrounding this whole interest. And I'm going to touch on that at the end of the talk as well. At the get-go, I want to thank Forest Lawn Cemetery. They brought me to this project. Joseph Dispenza, who's here today, is a phenomenal person and a fantastic force, and is somebody that does not accept the answer no. And you'll learn more about that in this talk, but my gratitude to them for this project. It was really a wonderful opportunity. The Red Jacket Monument is really a unique monument. For a unique person in a unique place. Red Jacket was given the name originally when he was born, Oti Tayani, and he was born in 1750. He was later to be known as Sagu Yawatha, the keeper awake, or he who keeps them awake, because he was an amazing orator and spent much of his life trying to preserve the lands for his people. Just a remarkable person. He took the name Red Jacket because he aided the British during the Revolutionary War. And you can imagine at that time, the Native Americans here were probably trying to pick the lesser of evils to preserve their culture and land. Unfortunately, we know how that war went, and so the Seneca ended up losing a lot of the territory in this region due to their support for the British. So following the war, the Seneca did have seceded much of their land to the United States, and many of them moved to Canada and what is now the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. And Red Jacket supported the United States later for the War of 1812, so sort of changed his positions and strategies. He became chief of the Wolf Clan of the Seneca Nation and one of the 6 Seneca nations of the Iraqi League or Confederacy. He led a delegation in 1792 to the United States Capitol in Philadelphia at the time, where President George Washington, impressed with Red Jacket, commissioned and gifted a large engraved silver medal honoring their meeting. The medal is now held in the collection of the Erie County and Buffalo Historical Society. I'll show that in a minute. And it depicts Red Jacket holding a peace pipe and Washington reaching forward with his right hand in a sign of peace. Red Jacket signed the treaty of, I don't know the pronunciation properly for this, Canandaigua, if anyone could pronounce that for me. It's a nearby community. Canandaigua, thank you very much. And that gave a proper ownership to land here in upstate New York. He gave it also, he has just, an amazing grasp of vocabulary and intellect, a phenomenal writer. And he wrote a really moving piece in response to Jacob Crum. He was a New England missionary, Jacob Cram. But Red Jacket's paper, Religion for the White Man and the Red, it's a really moving piece. I think everybody should have an opportunity to look that up online. It's an amazing paper. At age 78, he died in Buffalo, at Buffalo Creek, and that was in 1830. He was buried in an old Indian burial ground on Botham Street in South Buffalo, and the remains were exhumed and reinterred at Forest Lawn in 1884, along with Young King, Destroy Town, Captain Pollard's wife and granddaughter, Tall Peter, and Little Billy. 9 others were also, that were unidentified but thought distinguished, were exhumed and buried there as well. They're at a head plot that enters, it's at the entry to the cemetery. It's quite a prominent space, and deservingly so. Eli Parker, he was a prominent Native American who was a top aide to General Ulysses S. Grant, was the first Native American to be appointed to the post of Commissioner of Indian Affairs by President Grant, is also interred there at the cemetery. So that's the historical background to this piece. My introduction was a phone call asking me to do an assessment of some monuments at Forest Lawn by photograph to get an idea of the conditions and costs for treating some of the sculptures on the grounds. And as you saw earlier, the grounds are quite ornate. They're stunningly beautiful. And so I'm reluctant to do assessments by photographs, but given the time frame that we had to approach this, I did it under the condition that this would be a very loose proposal and that it would have to accommodate any other conditions that could not be observed through the photographs. And so I submitted a proposal and assessment of the monument. Here are some inscriptions on the front. So the bronze stands, I think, about 11'6" tall. The base is, I think, about 15 to 18 feet. Beautiful inscription, still intact with westerly granite, an amazing stone. And fortunately, the artist, which is James J.C. Hamilton, had a lot of artwork to base the portrait on, which was fantastic. Because he was such a notable Native American, there were many portraits made of him at the time. And you can see in every portrait he has that wonderful medallion given to him by Washington. And it's very interesting in how they actually depict Red Jacket in the medallion. None of the portraits, you'll notice, have him wearing this sort of bizarre attire. But that was in the medallion. But he was quite proud of it, as you might imagine, having it been given by George Washington. And so he did wear it whenever he posed for portraits. And he is wearing it in this sculpture as well. Now the sculpture is highly corroded, mostly of an even green, light green powdery corrosion products of copper sulfates. The light green surfaces indicate surface loss. You'll see, it's nice seeing those two images together and how an artist sort of simplifies things to be read at a distance without the detail of a fine etching. But you can also see the surface pitting on the surface of the bronze itself. There's actually a remarkable amount of copper alloy that's lost due to acid rain. And here's a detail. So you can see the deep pitting on the surfaces, which is worse in horizontal regions that harbor more water. And the more water that sits in the pits that are being caused, you get more reaction that occurs and the pits get deeper and deeper. And there's a detail of the figure in the medallion. And there is also some black corrosion streaking in the recessed regions. They tend to develop a raised crust, and it really obscures sculptural quality. In one image, I wanted to show this now, remember this, and I'll show you the same image at the end. But there's so much sculptural detail. Hamilton did a wonderful job showing the beautiful tassels within the cloak that he's wearing. There's a lot of modeling all over the surface that just can't be read under those conditions, both with the streaking of the green and the black and just the powdery quality of the surface that gives everything a flat appearance. And there's a detail of that recess. There was a lot of debris and soiling in recesses, mud wasp nests, bird nests, that sort of thing, accumulation of years and years of just air-blown debris. And failing fills. While the exterior casts and all the visible portions had pretty tight Roman joints, and those joints are usually made by having a tenon fit into a mortise socket, much like the gravestones are set into a base. And so you'll have a bronze extruded portion coming, let's say, from an arm that'll fit into the shoulder. And then that joint is hammered and pinned flush, and the whole seam chased, so you can't even see the joint itself. And when it corrodes a little bit, it's almost flawless, a continuous surface. However, the foundry, they did a great job with all the areas that you could clearly see, but underneath the recesses where I forgot what he's holding in his hand here. Yeah, in that seam itself, the joinery was one of the worst that I'd ever seen with a cast. Huge openings, over a ½ inch to an inch wide and really long. And they were all filled with wax, which was really intriguing. And it talks about also the process itself. They could only apply that wax later after they had actually waxed or oiled the surface. But if you were to heat the sculpture now for any future treatment, all that wax would melt and be completely lost, right? So it has no longevity for maintenance or any type of treatment whatsoever. So we pulled out that failing wax, and we filled the seams with lead, hammered lead. And we did that to keep all the mud wasps and other bugs and stuff out of the interior of the cast. Anything that goes into the hollow is simply going to either hang onto the cast itself, possibly cause more corrosion that might come through the pores, but more than that, it's going to go to the base of the sculpture, accumulate, and then cause possible staining to the stone below. It's just not a good thing to have on the interior. It's best to keep the interior of the cast as clean as you can. So we hammered all of the lead to conform to the seams, textured it, and we'd later patinate it. And then we cleaned loose corrosion with pressurized water, and got the soiling off, which is using Orvis, a nice detergent, very clean and safe to use. And all of our water is treated, and I do this with all historic cemeteries and stonework as well. A very simple filter, activated charcoal and a 30-micron filter. You can get it at Home Depot. Very cheap, but very effective for filtering water. Then the surfaces were patinated. It was a decision that had to be made when entering the cemetery. This sculpture really greets all the visitors to the site. And it's a very historic site. And at the entry, there were two other sculptural objects, an aged bell that's a very even green color, and a more modern sculpture that was actually patinated to match the green colors of both Red Jacket and the bell. So we had to keep the color of the sculpture congruous with that entry of an aged but well-maintained grounds. And that was really imperative. Joseph told me from the get-go that that would be the way to go with the sculpture, and I completely agree with that philosophy. And so we patinated the surface with some cupric nitrate and evened out the black quality, those black highlights on the sculpture so that you could then read the details much more closely. Now, one thing we didn't anticipate was that this sculpture sits on a very, very closely matched diameter of the granite base. So the granite base rises up, I'd say it's 18 feet in the air, and then only has about a 3/16 of a reveal between the granite and the beginning of the bronze sculpture. So those diameters are so closely matched. It's a beautiful, beautiful match. However, the sculpture was very, very so closely matched and had walked a little bit over and actually off the surface. Now, you can imagine there was, I think, about 32 linear inches of bronze overhanging the stone, which is a huge percentage for this piece. And my initial reaction was that often they'll put interior blind pins. There were no visible pins on the top of the self base of the bronze. So I knew that there was not an anchor just extending down from the top. Often they'll just drill a hole through the top of the self base of a bronze, throw in an anchor, grout it into the masonry below, and it's fairly stable. You know that it's suddenly not going to, fall over. There was no top hardware, so I was assuming it was blind pinned. And sometimes they'll put cross bracing on the interior of the cast, have a blind pin, or they'll have pins or large sections of bronze extend down, let's say, through the leg, through the bronze self base into the stone below, and then that will secure it to the base. I was assuming that's what was happening here, because you could actually shake the sculpture a little bit, and it actually seemed fairly stable. It just looked like it was wobbling back and forth a little bit. I thought, well, that was actually ingenious of them, if that was how they anchored it, because then it took the weight of the sculpture off that very edge of the westerly granite base. you can imagine that this is only 3/16 from the edge. If you get a spalled configuration, particularly with it hanging over a tiny bit, this could easily topple. So I thought, well, that was pretty smart. Let's say they lifted it up a little bit. It felt like it was more oscillating than just rocking back and forth. And I was fairly confident that that was it, and we could nudge it back. So I drilled a hole and looked inside with the borescope and saw that there were no pins whatsoever. That this was just freestanding on the base. I was power washing this thing. It's the first monument. I have never seen anything so daring as this ever. I was floored. So I went down to talk to Joe. I said, Joe, we have a problem. The sculpture's not attached to the base. It's actually really close to toppling. And Joe got right on the phone, called International Chimney, and said, look, we have a problem. We need to stabilize the sculpture here, and we need to do it in 3 days. We need you all to design a system, fabricate it, get a crane down here, lift the sculpture, and reset it. And there was panic on the other end of the phone. And Joe said, we've been working together for some years now, right? And I could hear the person nodding on the other end of the line. And Joe said, we could work together and make this happen, correct? And Joe is a tour de force. He is an inspirational person. He is so optimistic. And it all came together. And in that meeting, we actually came up with a brilliant design, and Joe was a part of that. Now, just to get an idea how close this could have been to toppling, the average wind speed in Buffalo is 11.8 miles an hour. Wow. That doesn't mean much. But however, here's some high gust recordings, 82 miles an hour, right? And down to 70 miles an hour. I mean, given its height and its configuration, that alone could easily blow the sculpture back off the base. And not only that, well, let's add seismic activity to that. Now, this is in New York, and a lot of this is within this region in upstate New York. And so there are some serious concerns here that may go unnoticed with continuous seismic activity. It's minor compared to California, but there's some shaking happening. And so with that in mind, we thought we really need to get this up. And so we lifted the sculpture. Look down at the base. You could actually see, it's hard to detect here, but you can see where it was overhanging on this section of the westerly granite, and you can see how large the reveal is on this portion. So you can get an idea of how close it was to the edges. And over the years, or even during the setting, they just stabilized it with wood, that might be my shim, with lead shims. And what I was seeing when I was actually rotating it, it was oscillating. It wasn't, and I hadn't even considered that kind of movement. I looked more for rocking, but the whole thing was actually rolling in a circle. And so you can imagine that kind of constant movement with wind and how that might create microfractures around the edge of the stone. And so there was a huge concern that we needed to actually get the sculpture off of the edge. And so Joe is actually the one that came up with the brilliant idea of, he said, well, let's just put it on a big stainless steel plate. I was like, that's actually just a brilliant idea. So now the sculpture, this stabilizing armature was designed to have the sculpture rest on this outer perimeter, taking the weight off from the granite. These little arms or plates, wedges, would be adjusted to fit the exact dimension of the sculpture by loosening these nuts and pushing them forward and then rebolting them. And then that would prevent the sculpture from having any kind of walk. And I didn't want to actually have to drill through the sculpture itself, but the engineer is very concerned that we had to have some pinning between the sculpture and this new armature. So we did have to drill holes around the base and into these bronze plates that are screwed to the stainless steel. So these bronze plates are going to minimize galvanic corrosion. If anything's going to happen, we're going to have some corrosion that's going to occur more on the back plate than this mid plate that's in contact with the bronze. And so this system should be extremely stable for a very, very long time. There's a top view of the plate, and then again the bronze piece that's going to meet the actual bronze sculpture. And so the bronze was lowered down. It was taken off by crane, lowered onto this plate. The plate had, at each contact point, had a chisel mark, so we knew exactly where it was going to line up when it was taken off again with the bronze sculpture. Well, let's back up just for a second. Yeah, so once it was in place, they fit everything together. They expanded all of those sleeves and fit it extremely well. So then the plate was brought back up to the top of the westerly granite base and anchored into place with stainless steel and grout. And that's looking at the plate before the sculpture was reattached to the top of the base. That's an old keyhole for lifting the stone monument. Yeah. So now we're lowering the bronze back down into the sculpture. And originally I thought that the sculpture was pinned through these Roman joint sockets because they're extremely strong points where they would insert a bar from that point down into the granite. And that's what I was really thinking was truly holding the sculpture on, and that they had elevated it ever so slightly, and that's what allowed it to walk over that bit that was overhanging. But I was sure we're wrong about that. And so here it's, there's one of the marks on the base, and so we had to drill a hole there to meet the bronze plate behind. We had actually pretty tight space between the artist's signature and there was a foundry mark on the other side, but there's the artist's signature on the bronze as well. And that was patinated then to match in color. And then the sculpture was coated with an acrylic resin, Incralac. It's gone through a lot of accelerated tests and always comes up with one of the top performing products for coating bronze sculpture. It's developed for copper roofs initially, but holds up very well. And they should have like a 15-year lifespan on the sculpture without any required maintenance. And there's the monument after treatment. And it was rededicated, and it was an amazing ceremony. We had Assembly member Sam Hoyt. He secured a grant for the efforts, and he attended and spoke, which was really wonderful. But it was also really wonderful to have a blessing from a descendant of Red Jacket attend and speak and re-bless the site. That was just, it was a special treatment. Yeah, so that was fantastic. I just want to look at this briefly, and then I may, and then we can watch a quick video if there's time for that part. But there's some treatments that are being done, and I can't say where or by who, that are so invasive, but this is by a conservator and overseen by a landscape architect. But the amount of damage that's being done to actually try and prevent damage to the stone is dumbfounding. So what we have are Connecticut sandstone monuments that are sheeting large portions of the face about 2 inches thick, or developing cracks along entire planes where the front plane of the carved face is starting to delaminate. But to prevent damage to the carved face of the stone, they drilled hundreds of holes through the surface, put stainless steel anchors, and injected grouts in behind. If there has to be a more sympathetic way, I know there's a more sympathetic way of preserving a face than this. And so my my question to everyone and my concern is that here we have two bodies, both very capable bodies, individuals, coming up with an end result like this completely unchecked. And it's not intentionally bad. I mean, there was quite a bit of craftsmanship that went into this. I mean, despite the damage. Not a great selection of materials and stuff in the end, but there were obviously very skilled people working at this site. It just seems, and this has come up again several times today, that there needs to be some way that we can monitor work that's being done on these historic cemeteries that are so amazingly valuable, and on the National Registry. And if nothing else, objects that are on the National Registry maybe have some sort of governing body that allows some oversight where conservators might be able to look at treatments, give ideas, evaluate treatments for regions that are maybe not in conflict with their own area that they're working. So you're not going to, particularly with private conservators, be stepping on toes of people that are working your area or trying to, broaden your work base in any way. To keep it as pure as possible and just looking at what the conservation plans are and what the end results might be to come up with a real responsible and good procedure for doing this. And it seems like they've certainly developed these systems, and it sounds like in Canada and definitely in Europe. And I hope that we in some way can get together and figure out how we can devise some systems that work for us here. Because to me, this is just not acceptable. And if there's time, I'll show the brief video. If not, we can all go have a snack. Yeah.
How long is it?
It's short, it's 5 minutes.
Okay. Is this it right here?
Yeah, it's the top one.
It was the first monument that I've treated, but not first doing an on-site inspection. Given time constraints, so for the rededication, we had to look at the photographs of the monument back in Connecticut, come up with a treatment plan, arrive here with all of our equipment, and then discover that the sculpture actually had some other major issues that were just unforeseen. While walking around the monument, it became apparent very quickly that the bronze was actually overhanging the stone pedestal. The sculpture sits up on the pedestal 18 feet or so. The footprint of the bronze matches the granite so precisely that any overhang actually entails quite a circumference of the bronze itself. So 32 linear inches were migrating off the stone. We actually went up on the scaffold, shook the monument, and it appeared to be rotating, so I assumed that there would be interior pins holding it in place and maybe even lifting it to take the pressure off the stone right at the points where the bronze meets the granite. Well, we actually started the treatment, but I knew I had to look in the interior, so we drilled a hole and then with the borescope looked inside and found out that the bronze sculpture wasn't anchored at all. It's the first sculpture I've ever encountered that had no anchors whatsoever. Quite honestly, the next big storm actually could have caused the sculpture to topple. Once we saw that there was no pinning at all, there was absolutely no question. It was a safety hazard for the people here at the cemetery, and obviously threatened the sculpture itself. So there was just no question it had to come down. The remarkable thing was how quickly it happened. Within 3 days, they actually engineered the drawings, fabricated the piece, lifted the object up, secured it, re-anchored it. It was remarkable. I've never seen anything come together so quickly and actually so beautifully. So it was brilliant to come up with this inner plate. International Chimley they carried out the design beautifully. It was really engineered in a brilliant, brilliant way. The sculpture itself is actually balanced very well. Some sculptors give care in thinking about how objects will be moved once it leaves their studio. This piece actually lifted beautifully with two single basket straps, equal length, perfectly level. It was a wonderful, wonderful pick, and we were really fortunate about that. The sculpture had been patinated before the move, so we were very, very careful to cover all the surfaces to make sure that they wouldn't get dirty or greasy in any way. First, when we arrived and we thought it might be stable, we began our treatment process, which involved using a high-pressure water system for removing loose corrosion. We made sure all the larger openings were sealed with lead, and the small openings we sealed actually with a bronze-impregnated epoxy. Then we were ready for really one of the more entertaining parts of the process, and that's to try and patinate the sculpture to retain its aged quality. From the very beginning of the project, Joseph Dispenza made it very clear that this was the entry to the cemetery, and this entry should represent what you're going to find within these beautiful grounds. And it was very important that they sort of maintain the aged quality, but still have it maintained. And so we took more of a preservation stance rather than restoration. So we tried to preserve the green appearance of the object. And in order to do that, we actually have to patinate the surface a deeper green, because when it gets coated later in this process, it would become much too dark. So the patination process is vital for two reasons. It adds a slight protective finish to the surface. It gains a more attractive appearance once it's coated, but it also evens out a lot of the irregularities. So we patinate the surface by heating it with a propane torch, quite hot actually, and then spray on a patina, and it actually induces green corrosion with the bronze surface. And so it's a very stable surface when we're finished. Once the sculpture was patinated and we really retained a beautiful even green appearance, the final coat, protective coating, was applied, and we selected an acrylic resin. This clear coat will protect the surface from all pollutant contact in the future, well, at least for the life of the coating. And since we wanted to try and maintain as much of the sort of untouched, aged quality about the sculpture, we decided to use the acrylic resin. It's an amazing piece. The sculpture quality is fantastic. The sculptor Hamilton did a remarkable job. The amount of detail is phenomenal, and that was just slowly, during the conservation process, all that detail reveals itself, and it's quite remarkable to actually see the sculpture bring itself forth, so you can see the whole entity as the sculpture originally designed it, and in that also getting a glimpse of the character that the sculptor had created.
All right. And do we have any final